In the previous episode, I discussed a series of concepts regarding literacy in video games. In this second episode, I'm going to break this down further by further explaining some of the underpinning assumptions that we have to make. Some of these concepts are incredibly dense, incredibly complex, and are worthy of having their own dissertations or theses published about them. Unfortunately, I do not have the requisite time or ability to go through each and every one of these, because it really would be a lifetime's work. What I can do is signpost individual pieces so that interested parties can go and start finding things for themselves, which inducts them into the literacy of a specific topic. And I find that a lot of people have issue with this word literacy. So let's take that as our starting block and say, right, we are used to using the word in a specific way, and the way in which it is generally used means reading and writing. Now, the first thing, and to some it will seem like an obvious point, and to others it could seem like a silly point, but it is important because it is so ingrained into us from a young age about words and letters, is that there is no such thing as an alphabet. You cannot go into the world and pick up an A, or a B, or a C. We do not have things called A's, or B's, or C's. And yet we have a language which is based on A's and B's and C's. This is the first fundamental concept when it starts to talk about literacy. Because we study language in its written form at a young age, many of us forget that it is not a natural thing for us to do. It is something that is learnt, for some painstakingly, over a series of years. It is something that we take for granted as having learned. And in the modern world, we take it for granted that most, if not all people, can understand the written word. Go back 100 years, and this wasn't the case, and many of the ideas expressed when we're talking about semiology and semantics and everything else, many of these were written by learned men when this wasn't the de facto position of society. A very interesting case to illustrate the point, which again, I could spend hours decoding just those three words, illustrate the point, is many moons ago there was a video on the thinking atheist, Seth MacAndrew, and he was talking about satanic panic in the 80s. And one of the things that he was talking about was a logo, I believe for Procter & Gamble, which which gained currency amongst certain Christian believers, that this logo was in fact a satanic symbol. And what was lost in the whole debacle was the fact that crates were marked with logos, with symbols, so that people could learn the symbol for their company and not when they weren't able to read the side of a crate and say this belongs to Procter & Gamble or GlaxoSmithKline. These were things made up to represent the company so that someone could go, that's the logo, that's the sigil for that company, that goes to that person, that goes to the other person. And this is something that in the modern world we have taken for granted. And like I say, there are hundreds of thousands of words. There's a lifetime's work in just explaining this and building up the arguments. In fact, many people like Wittgenstein and others spent most of their lifetimes trying to explain this. And the reason why I have gone back to brass tacks is because there seems to be this fundamental breakdown that we've seen in the recent presidential election in 2016 over what things mean. And one of the biggest things was the Pepe the Frog meme. Now, the word meme is of quite recent origin. It was only coined by Professor Dawkins in the last couple of decades. So this is something of a revolutionary aspect to it, because it is so new and it has become so widespread so quickly. Now, Pepe the Frog, in and of himself, is another character where thousands of man hours, litres and litres of ink could be spent just on decoding where this character came from, what he's meant to represent, and everything else. It is not my intention to do so. Pepe the Frog is merely an adjunct. It's to serve as an illustration. And the reason he stands as such an interesting point is that when you look at him, he looks nothing like a frog. Yet he's recognised as a frog. And for him to be recognised as a frog, we have to understand the concept of frog as distinct from an actual frog, because you can go out into the wild and pick up a frog, and you can pick up frogs with the same sort of colouring, and you can pick up frogs that look nothing like Pepe. But there is a certain amount of caricature built into the icon, the simulacra, the copy of a frog that is Pepe, that it is recognisable to those who know that it is Pepe the Frog when they see this picture. Now, if you've never seen this picture before, you have no idea what it is. And again, to use another example, there is a picture that goes around as a meme of Kermit the Frog drinking tea. And it's obviously some kind of herbal tea, because you can see in the glass that it's a clear liquid with a tea bag in, and it's not cloudy, which means there's no milk in it. And there have been those that did not know that it was Kermit the Frog, and they called it tea drinking lizard, because to them the character of Kermit the Frog, the puppet, resembled a lizard to them and not a frog. And this is important because the characteristics and the understanding between the two groups were both right in the fact that it was a copy of something seen in nature which did not accurately represent nature but resembled it. And if you did not know who Kermit was, then it wouldn't be a far stretch of the imagination to think that it was a lizard. And for those of you who don't know who Kermit the Frog is a very famous Muppet who used to appear on a TV show called The Muppets, and he was the leader of a gang of misfits who used to put on a show in a ramshackle theatre. It was aimed at kids, but was really a family show and did very well in the 70s and 80s before having a resurgence in the early 2000s, if I understand correctly. Now, what have this got to do with video games? Well, this is exactly the same thing. Several generations of computer ago, representations of things in the real world weren't quite so easy to manage in a highly true way. They weren't true to the real world. There wasn't a lot of fidelity, there wasn't a lot of truth to them, because they were rendered in 8-bit pixels. And if you know what I mean by 8-bit pixels, then you are computer literate to the fact that you understand the language that is being used. And the reason I use this is I had a very good comment recently to the first video where he was talking about various principles, and one of the things that was brought up was that by the use of language you had the power to change the world. And the example that was used was the words, "I now pronounce you man and wife." I take issue with this because what you are dealing with is a ceremony which itself is full of symbols, of codified information. You are talking about actions within the ceremony which represent certain things, such as the presentation of rings. The rings themselves are something which is understood as something other than what they are, a symbol. And if you go through the whole of the marriage ceremony, you will find a whole nested hierarchy of signs, symbols, simulacra, even down to the clothes that are worn and the very fact of the presiding principal or priest. The very fact that the priest says, "I now pronounce you man and wife," doesn't change the world unless he has the authority to do so. And the authority to do so comes from both his position as priest, which is in itself codified, but the whole of the ceremony preceding the words. Anyone can walk down the street, pick out 2 random people and say, "I now pronounce you man and wife," and he hasn't changed the world one bit. Likewise, language doesn't change the world. It is only if the person speaking is seen to have the authority. And I do believe that this is where most of the arguments from the movement that was known as Gamergate come about. Now, I know this is a highly divisive topic, and I will be speaking about this in an abstract and glancing way in this video. But it is important because what you are looking at with it is you are looking at a set of people who have a certain set of coda. They have been inducted into a movement where they have been given the tools to look at certain things and decode them in a certain way. And then you are looking at other people that are coming from a completely different direction, who may not have been inducted into the same things, or may even have been inducted into something which is completely opposite to the other group. And what we have is a clash where one group is saying that the world is a certain way, and another group which counters that. And the whole reason why the Gamergate controversy took place over the last couple of years is because you have two groups of people who are ideologically opposed to one another. Whether or not they intend to be, the ideology that rests within their signs, their symbols, and their understanding of the signs and symbols is what drives the controversy. You can see the same picture and take completely different information from it because your frames of reference, these signs and symbols that you recognize as being signs and symbols and being information carriers, have given you different sets of information. And this is why it is important to try and understand as much as possible where someone's argument is coming from. And again, to illustrate another point, we are going to quickly look at religion and atheism. And again, I'm not going to get into a whole great debate about this. This is only in glancing. This is to show, in principle, where these divisions can take place. And where these divisions take place with the atheism and the religious people come, is that whether you take a deist or a theist position, that means that you either believe in an inducted religion or you believe in a general God but you don't believe in a religion, deist, you have to have the concept of a God principle. Now, again, better people than I will have written thousands of pages on what is a God, what is the concept of a God, why is a God, how is a God. But basically put, in the fundamental terms, when humanity did not know much about the world, there was a tendency to ascribe agency to things that we now recognise don't have agency. What do I mean by agency? What I mean by agency is the ability to think, act and react in a recognisable way. Take for instance a cat. You do certain things to a cat, it will act and it will react, and then if you carry on doing something it doesn't like, it will remember that, which is thinking, and then take steps never to come near you again. The same with a dog. Operant conditioning, Pavlov, all the rest of it. You can show that these animals can think, they can act, and they can react. They have their own reasons for doing what they do, like the dog when he circles around his bed 4 or 5 times before laying down. You don't know why he does it, but to him it makes sense. That is agency. And early on, agency were given to mountains, to forests, to the sky, clouds. And as this idea increased, then the agency became more powerful. So instead of the clouds themselves having agency, it was a being that lived in the clouds, a being that lived in the mountain, a being that lived in the forest. And this concept grew until it became a select number of powerful beings which controlled multiple things. And then eventually you move into monotheism, which is where there is one God that is in control of everything. But if you do not recognise this basic principle of anima, of agency, outside of what you can see, touch, feel and hear, then you reject the very principle that is at the very basis of what a God is. So when arguments happen between an atheist and someone who has any kind of religious leaning, it is important, and this is again another good topic to look this up, is to look at the atheist experience, where generally speaking when people phone up they say, what is it you believe and why? It is important to generate an understanding of the terms of the conversation, because if you do not understand the terms of the conversation, then you cannot move meaningfully forward, because there's no basis for understanding. In the Latin, there is no consensus ad idem as to what is being discussed. There is no meeting of minds. There is no way that you are talking about the same things in the same way, and you have a massive disconnect between what one side is saying and the other. And this happened with Gamergate. You had a series of people on one side saying one thing and a series of people on the other side saying, no, we don't believe that, it's something else. And the biggest problem with Gamergate is this question of authority, which is what I was talking about with the priest. Do you see how I've linked all this together? The priest has the authority to say certain things. And within Gamergate, again, there's a number of people who saw or believed that they had authority to speak in a certain way. And there were other people who rejected that authority. And what became a major sticking point was why that authority and how that authority was rejected. And this comes to the nub of why I started looking at this issue, why I produced the previous video, and why I'm looking at this video now. And the reason why I'm doing this video now is, after the dust has settled and we've all calmed down a bit and no one is shouting past one another, is to say that unless and until these fundamental things are understood, that we are at a complete and utter cultural impasse. There is nothing that can be gained from either side, because we have reached a point of stalemate where no one is listening. Everyone's arguing, but no one's listening. And it comes down to this thing of authority. Who is authoritative? Who has the ability to actually turn around and say that A actually means A and not Z? This is the fundamental principle, and the reason for this video is because I believe that this is something which hasn't been discussed, because it is seen as such a simple thing that everyone assumes that everyone knows what everyone else is talking about. And unfortunately, sometimes it is the simple questions which can be the hardest to answer. So what is the point that I'm trying to make? What is the problem that I'm trying to solve? Well, quite simply, the reason for this series, and now that I've had my attention brought back to the series, and I have to admit it has been remiss of me because of other studies, that I haven't paid this the due that potentially I should have done, and I will hold my hand up and say mea culpa on that. The whole point of this series is to look at some of the most basic, fundamental building blocks of what makes a video game and why video games are the way they are. Now, to understand this, we have to look at the way in which early interpretations of video games were. And they were to bring across a very specific narrative in a very specific space of time, usually between 3 and 5 seconds on a tracked screen on computers with not a lot of power, in order to have a sense of emotional connection to people, to say, oh, I want to play that. That looks interesting. Doesn't have to convey anything more than that. Oh, what's that? I want to play it. It's shiny. It's new. It's different. And you can see this every time you put a video game in front of a child who's never played a video game before. There's something on the screen, potentially that they recognise, potentially that they don't. But there are signifiers as to what it is that you are, what you're supposed to be doing. And then you press buttons and find out what happens. And this feedback is 100% scientific method. I have a hypothesis, I test it, I get results, which may or may not change my hypothesis. I change another button, I get a result, which may or may not change my hypothesis. And through a process of what happens if I press this button, I expect X to happen if I press this button, I expect Y to happen if I press another button, you figure out how to control what is happening on the screen, and depending on skill level, how good you are at it. And at its basic principle, that is pretty much every video game design from the word go. You take control of something, whether it be a single person, whether it be an army, whether it be a first-person shooter, a character, a team of characters, or a city, as in something like Civilization. And you progress through the game by learning and doing. And every time you learn how to do something, you either improve, or you realise where you've made a mistake, or you make the mistake and learn for next time. And it is this narrative process of reinforcement which allows people to build connections with things like video game characters, like Mario and Sonic. These were logos, these were standout characters for which a brand was built around. So when you saw the fat Italian plumber in Donkey Kong, he was a nobody, he was just Jumpman. But when you see the same blue shirt, red overalls, cap, moustache in Super Mario World, you could recognise it as the same person. And likewise, because of the signifiers of that character, you can recognise it in Super Mario N64, you can recognise it in Paper Mario, because they are the same sigil, the same logo, the same information presented in a slightly different way. And this is the basis of pretty much all the video games that I have on the market. There is a certain set of principles that were built into the video game market because of the technology at the time, which have evolved but still bear the fingerprints of their original creation. Nothing we can do to get away with that. And until and unless you realise that, then there is no point in moving forward in the conversation, because it's something that has to be fundamentally recognised. You cannot look at a piece of evidence and take it completely out of its context and say it means something like this, when you have completely removed any of the other signifying codicils that make it what it is. It's like taking the priest out of the marriage ceremony and purely saying, I pronounce you man and wife, means that because he said it, it is so. No, it is because of the position that it's in. It is because of the hierarchy of the symbols and everything else that is in that position that makes something mean what it does. And in the modern world, we have become so used to the simulacra, so used to the facsimile, the copy, the meme. We have become so used to this world where we can take one thing and it means maybe 1,000 or 1,500 different things when you break it down into its constituent parts. But because we are so used to that one thing, we can instantly decode it. We have forgotten that there are those people out there which may or may not have a clue what on earth we're talking about. And this is some of the disconnect between generations. If you talk to someone who's never heard of Pepe the Frog, in their 70s, they will look at you like, go, what? What are you talking about? I haven't got a clue. You talk about someone in their 50s about Mario and Sonic, and they will understand them from the point of view where Mario and Sonic were probably in the 80s or early 90s. They won't necessarily know where Sonic and Mario are today. They may, if they still play the games, but you can't take that whole generalisation and say these people know X or these people know Y, just as you can't generalise that the whole world can read and write. But it is taken as read that the majority of people will read and write. The majority of people will understand language. And that isn't necessarily the case, but that is an expectation that people have. And there is an expectation in certain people's worldviews that everybody will understand a certain set of readings from an image or from a sentence. And in the gaming world, we have now come to a divide. We have come to a point where that is not the case. We have one set of people reading things one way and one set of people reading things completely differently. And the only way this can be resolved is by breaking down some of these barriers and actually looking at what is being said. That was the initial impetus for this series of videos. And because of illness and because of moving forward in different ways, it has languished. And I do apologise for those that were quite interested in this. This is something that I will be picking up again. Now, hopefully we will be able to get these done quite quickly, because some of this has been rattling around in my brain for a number of years. So I know what it is that I want to say. I know the information I want to achieve. It is now just getting to a position where I can achieve those results. And I am now at the same time a full-time student, so my time has been limited. Whereas when I first conceptualised this series, I didn't have such pressure on my schedule. So you will have to forgive me for that. So that is the basis of where this series continues from here. And I very much appreciate anyone who has taken the time to listen to this, anyone who has any kind of input or understanding of certain things, because it will always be good to get other people who have a greater understanding than I. Because at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to break these down into more palatable chunks would possibly be a good way of explaining this, but not going so deep into it that we have to have a thesis to understand it. But if other people have got slightly different understandings and they can explain it in a slightly different way, then that would be excellent, because we don't have one atheist commentator on religion, we have hundreds. And I believe the only way we can sort out what's happening in the video game world is if we actually have hundreds of commentators talking in a similar way to me, trying to explain certain things, trying to explain certain ideas. So that is where we are now. I am Voice of the Forge. I can be found not only on YouTube but on Twitter, on sites like Twitch, and if you take a look at the channel you will notice there is a fair amount of gameplay. That's because my time has been limited and it has been more of a relaxation thing to do. I'll do a video, talk a bit about the video game, about other bits and pieces, rather than put in the hard graft that is sometimes required for a video of this nature. Because obviously my time is limited and I have to manage my time and everything else, and being a poor student, this is going to put extra pressure on finances, purely because if I'm doing this I can't be working, if I'm working I can't be doing this. So I would please encourage anyone that has an interest in this to look at the Patreon page which we have, Look at the Twitch channel where we have a Game Wisp account set up, just so that if they feel like donating, if they feel that they want more information, then even $1 a month, just something that will take some of the pressure off and ease the way forward, would be greatly, greatly appreciated. It isn't necessary, because to the best of my ability I will continue making the videos, but the more money I have in the ability to actually make the content and spend the time researching some of this content, then it will go to improve the channel in immeasurable ways. Sometimes $1 can make a huge amount of difference, because it's that 6% that's just missing from something. Like I say, it's not expected. It's some purely me turning around and saying, please, please, please help. That being said, any views, any exposure, any comments, any interaction at all is all greatly appreciated. And if we can start spreading this message so that we can actually look at what is being said, how it is being said, and where it is coming from, we might be able to break down some of these barriers that have grown up over the last couple of years. It may well be we can start defining terms which make more sense than Gamergate and anti-Gamergate. It may well be that we can move forward with the debate after it has reached this deadlock, which I do not see as being a bad thing. I think it is something essential for the gaming industry before it eats itself. And with that, I am now going to sign off. I am, as always, Voice of the Forge, and I thank you for your time and your patience.